Hi everybody, welcome to Sun Dragon Tips and Tricks. I'm Rebecca. I'm the owner of Sun Dragon Art and Fiber in Brevard, North Carolina. And I'm coming to you from my house on a Monday. So this is Rebecca at Home, episode 4. Dealing with allergies, but trying not to sneeze. So lots to talk about today, by the way. We had some questions come in. We have started our make along for the Staffen by Rebecca Clow. And we also are in February, and it's Finish or Froggit February. So there's tons to talk about. We're going to see what we get through. The two big topics are the make along and Finish or Froggit February. So I'm going to hold on to those for just a second and see if I can get through some of the other stuff before we get into the big topics. So, because if I start on the big topics, then all of a sudden we're done. We've run out of time. They all kind of bleed into each other, probably. I take notes on people's comments every time. And I'll address what I can. I'll offer videos I already have for what I can't. And we'll just see where we get to today. This is the fun part. So, so there was a question about the cowl I was making with, they described it as wool and metallic in black. And it's actually trying a couple of new yarns we got from Land du Nord in. And it is this guy, which is the Cash Silk Light, I believe it's called. And this is merino and cashmere and silk, and it's kind of like mohair. This is how much I have left, by the way. It's kind of like mohair, but it's a little thicker and fluffier. And that cashmere, I don't have the percentages in front of me. I want to say it's only 10% cashmere, but a lot of stuff, if you want like a high level of cashmere, it's going to get expensive really fast. And people come into our shop all the time wanting cashmere because that's what they've heard about and they know it's soft, and maybe they have a really delicate cashmere sweater and so they want to knit with cashmere. That's really expensive because it's from the down of cashmere goats, and you can only get it so often, and it takes like a bunch of goats to get the same amount you would get from like one sheep. So, and then we have this stuff. It's called Armé, and it is all kinds of sparkly, which is really fun. And I'm holding the two together, and they were wondering if I finished it. No, I haven't, but it bleeds over into Finish or Froggit February because I worked on it a bunch last night. I'm using a pattern called Just Try It. And this is how high it is now as a cowl. I just wanted to see how far I could get with one skein of each. I still have yarn left. This is the one that's going to run out first. There's still tons of glittery stuff. I could make a whole nother glittery thing with another color, right? Of this. There's still yarn left on this, so I am going to keep going until I get as high as it will let me. And if you see here, I'm holding two yarns together, and there's another strand here. The fuzzy stuff and the sparkly stuff. And sometimes this is called marling when you hold two yarns together. And if you hold two of the same yarns but different colors together, you'll get this neat effect where certain things pop out and certain things don't. And this just lets some sparkle shine through, and it's not as soft as the mohair stuff by itself, but I still don't think it's like scratchy. Another thing I'll point out about that kind of conversation is something scratchy. That often depends on the person. I might think something is not scratchy at all, and a customer will say, "You lied to me because it's scratchy." And it's like, no, I didn't. It's scratchy to you. It's not scratchy to me. That is a relative term. We are not all the same, but I digress. So this guy, I'm hoping this feeds into Finish or Froggit February. We'll be bouncing around these topics a lot, between throughout this episode. But this should hopefully be one of my first finishes. So since I've mentioned it a bunch of times, if it's your first time watching with us, Finish or Froggit February, FIOFIF is the acronym it makes. Was started, this is 3 years ago. This is our third annual Finish Your Froggit February, where I'm going to take the month, and I encourage everyone else to take the month of February to look through the works you in progress. We could say works, what you have on needles. Crochet projects, they're still works in progress if they're not finished. Liz, my assistant, only counts the projects she has on needles because they lock up that pair of needles. Like with a crochet hook, you can take out the hook and use it on something else. So she doesn't really call it a work in progress for her because it's not eating up supplies. But she has, of knitting projects, she has over 200 on needles at some random place in her house. And last time I checked, I count both my knit and crochet projects. Things that are not finished is what I would say. And I have over 40. And with Finish Your Froggit February, I'm not always successful, but my goal is to cut that number in half. And it doesn't mean I have to finish or frog That would be nothing left on my needles or in like needing a hook before the end of the month. I try to get half of them off the needles or free up the hook too. And so my categories are, and most of these work for everybody else too, is actually finish the project. That's great. It's not going to happen for 40 projects. Frog it, which if you haven't heard that term before, a lot of knitters and crocheters are familiar with it, but it's ripping out your project or ripping back on your project because you rip, like it's backing out your work. Let me back up a second. It's backing out your work because when you back it out, you rip it. You rip the stitches apart. You're not ripping the yarn into pieces, but you rip the stitches apart and rip it. Sounds like ribbit in English. So it's called frogging. And so you can frog the project, decide to kill it. Like, I'm never going to finish it. Why is it still hanging out in my house? And there's lots of reasons you're leaving it unfinished. There's like, you just don't want to give up on it, or you love the yarn, in which case use it for something else. But so finishing, frogging, ending, terminating, pledging to finish, like anything that makes it through this month, which I'm hoping will be about 20 projects. I don't have to finish them this month or else I'm a failure, because that would be near impossible. But I'm pledging that, yeah, this is worth it. It makes it through because I think there's a reason I want to finish it, even if it takes a really long time. And then for me as a shop owner, I give myself the fourth option of maybe I will bind it off where it is as a sample for the shop. Unfinished, you know, like only a little piece of what it would have become so people can feel how it knits up. And there's a lot of decisions that could go into that too. So I don't have to frog something. I could bind it off and cherish it as a memento of the work that I did. You know, and that might work for people who are like, I just can't rip out what I've worked on. But you might decide that, okay, but I'm not going to finish it. And I have run out of juice to work on it. And it's just sitting there staring at me in the corner. So in that case, you may want to just bind it off, free up your needles, and say, you know what, I'm done with this project. It's too traumatic to rip it out, but I'm going to leave it. So often the frogging, the ripping out part is because you might want to use the yarn for something else. A lot of us don't want to waste what we've bought, right? So that's another question that came up, is what do you do with your yarn after frogging? Because so I frogged a shawl this morning, and when you frog it, like if I take this off, it's already a lot less kinked up than it was, right? When you first pull out a project that you have knit, like that one's holding its kink better. Ooh, kinky. But when you pull the stitches out, it wants to keep the shape it was in when you had the stitches on your needle. And people deal with that in a lot of different ways. I jokingly say I'm lazy about it. So if you ask what I do with the yarn, some people are like, okay, it's all kinked up, I can't use it again. I do. I do. And see, just winding it on this, like you can see that this part's still a little kinky right in there. Just winding it up into a ball again can help some of that relax and come out. And sometimes it won't come out. But I am not super afraid of using it again. And either that kinkiness might show up and the stitches might look funky, or it might blend in because the needles are, I'm probably going to use the same size needles, and the stitches or blocking could help it settle. If reusing yarn or having it wound up too long, there's all kinds of reasons the yarn may not keep its beautiful shape that it was when you first bought it. And a lot of that depends on the fibers in the yarn and what you've done with the yarn and how long it is sat wound. That's why some people say when it comes in the twist, don't wind it until you need it because it could stretch it out. Frogging could stretch it out. You know, like winding it into a really tight ball could change how elastic it is. It can change how your gauge is going to be next time. So if you got gauge on a project your first time out, if you've frogged a piece and left it in a ball like this, you may want to test your gauge again. You know, I'll tell you the fancy thing that some people do, which I don't have much practice with, so I will recommend it to you. And if you really want to, this is something a lot of people do when it's all like looped up and trying to keep the shape. It's like the memory of the project, right? We talk about memory in circular cable needles, just circular needles, the cable of the circular needles. It's kind of like that, but for yarn. And some yarn will have it and some yarn won't. What like the professionals do, you know, I don't even consider myself a professional, but people who are really concerned about that will, if they have a nitty naughty, which is like a bar with a line this way and a line that way at the end, they can string it on that, which gives them that big band. That's like what your twist, if you buy a twist of yarn, pops out into. They band up the yarn again, and you can put some ties on it, and then they hang it on a hanger or something where they can run a steamer gently over it to kind of steam out that memory. It's the same thing people do with cords sometimes when the cords have too much memory in them, when you're circular needles. But you can steam out the wrinkles basically, and then it's in a nice twist form that you can twist up until you want to use it again instead of being in a tight ball. So I'm sure there are a lot of crazy, awesome videos out there on that. That's not what I particularly do. I say I'm a lazy knitter. You know, all this work we put in and all these other things I'm not lazy about, this is one of the things I'm kind of lazy about. The same thing with blocking your gauge swatch. I don't do that. I measure the yarn by itself, which, you know, some people would say, but then how do you know if it's going to grow? When you block the end piece, I know the end piece will probably change shape or settle a little bit. My concern with blocking your gauge swatch is just to be very careful about blocking it the same way you're going to block your sweater or whatever you're making when you're done. So, and I don't tend to test my gauge for things like shawls. Shawls I might aggressively block when I'm done, like stretch it out. But if I'm doing a little square for my gauge, and usually I'll make it bigger than the stitch count for 4x4, because I want to measure in the center where the curl of the edges isn't being wonky. If I make a square, if I block it, what I'm concerned with when people block their gauge swatch and then say their gauge swatch lied to them is they have soaked it, done something else, rolled it up in a towel just like they're going to do with the sweater, and then they pin it to the right measurements to make sure it's going to work. Or something, or they stretch it out when they pin it. They want to make it look like a nice, perfect square. And if you do that, unless you are planning to super stretch your sweater when it's done, which means it's hard to try on as you're going because you're going to stretch it later when you block it, you're not going to get an accurate measurement of stitches for how your sweater's going to turn out. So that's why you might say, but I blocked it and now my sweater's too small. Or something like that, you know. So I I try to measure how the yarn and everything is naturally. And then I'm really gentle when I block it. So I might, sometimes when people block it, they don't get a lot of moisture out afterwards. And then it's heavy and it stretches. I'm really careful with my measurements and squishing it back into shape. And most of my sweaters at this point go into the washing machine on the spin cycle only, to get as much water out of it as possible so it's not going to stretch on the way to the blocking pads. But kind of a side tangent there, right? But that's recommendation on something you can do with post-frogged yarn. I personally just ball it up and use it again. And the biggest issue might be the frogged part versus the not frogged part of a ball of yarn can behave differently. And some of that's because it's been knit once. And some of that, like, it doesn't mean that steaming it is magically going to fix that. It like if you have to frog I've seen some cotton yarns that I thought it was fine, but the person reknitting with it really thought it looked funky and didn't like it compared to some brand new balls she hadn't used yet. So there's a lot of different answers you're going to find to that question. But, so, okay, that marks, I'm going to check off some things here. That guy. Someone mentioned, they like the idea of the Zoom sessions that I'm offering, because in other Zoom things, and I've done this too, it's recorded and we can have access to it later. The way I'm treating the Zoom sessions, the Coach and Connect, I changed the name of it after talking to y'all because I wanted to differentiate it from Sit and Stitch. Sit and Stitch is a free resource. It's not so much meant for asking questions and getting help. And that is on Tuesday nights on Zoom from, what do? We do 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern US time. And that's the shop phone number to get in, 828-877-3550. And Coach and Connect, which we had our first session of last Saturday. It was great. Every 2 weeks, we're doing that. It's only $40 for the whole session. You can still join in. It's still going to be $40, but that's still it was $10 a session if you got all of them for an hour each time. And it's a little more than that if you buy in now. But the participants we had, I think it was really great for them to both listen to me lecture a little bit about the make along and things that I thought were helpful, and to ask their questions. And it really is like a step up from a Sit and Stitch, but it's not quite a class. It's not quite and part of the reason I'm not recording it is it's bouncing around between a whole bunch of people asking questions and me showing techniques and things like that. And when I did the really formal classes, which took me like half a day to prepare for and make the boards and set up the cameras, and those I recorded and allowed for purchase later. This it's more informal. It's in between, and it's more meant for immediate feedback where you can talk to me and ask questions, and we're hanging out and sharing how things are going. So the Coach and Connect sessions will continue on February 15th, and there's 3 more sessions left. And I encourage you to buy in for those if you'd like to. I can always try to answer questions here, but you got to wait a week, that kind of thing. So, before we move on to more stuff about the make-alongs and FIOFIF, which I have lots of fun things to talk about with that. We did have a question which had a lot packed into it that came up last week about yardage and grams and weights of yarn, and maybe how to put loops on the needle. I don't know if they were talking about magic loop or just knitting in the round. And I have some videos on those that I will try to link in below. And about what they called the kitchenette stitch, which could have either been an autocorrect, or there's a lot of weird names for things in knitting, and they get transposed, or they get, that is the Kitchener stitch is probably what they were talking about. And that's what I used to bind up. It's called grafting as well. It's kind of binding your stitches together to have it still look like the knitting continued without a seam. It's called Kitchener, which gets confused with kitchen or kitchenette. It's actually named after a guy. Liz would get this right, in like the Crimean War or something, a lot of like soldiers actually named knit stitches or had knit stitches named after them, because that's back when guys knit more than they do today. There's a lot of guys who knit today, but it was more of everybody doing it thing back then. And the stereotypes that have developed since then, everybody knits still too, or can. So Kitchener was in the army, the British Army, and he didn't like seams on his socks. So the grafting of stitches that leaves no seam there is named after him. And I have a video on that too, so I will try to link that below. These are the kind of things that in this communication, it's kind of hard to show. So I have some better videos for that. I have it written down here. I will try to put in the description, Kitchener, magic loop, and joining to knit in the round. I hope those will answer some of those questions. Yardage and grams and weights is a pretty extensive conversation, but just very briefly, and I'll see if we can get into more detail on stuff like that later, is like this guy is wound back up again, but this guy, how they're sold is a lot of yarns are sold in 100 grams or 50 grams, and it's different with ounces. So the easier thing to do math on is the metric system. And see under here, it also talks about yards or meters. Notice how this is a nice even meterage for that nice even grammage. And a lot of yarns will try to do that, which is pretty cool. But where it gets hinky, a little bit hinky, is this thing called weight, which a lot of you out there may have heard about or already know about, but I always try to help people understand if they're new to the craft. Is weight sounds like, okay, we're talking about if something's heavy or light, and you will hear things like light fingering and heavy fingering. That's another word that gets transposed, by the way, or just kind of fudged, is people hear fingering and they change it to fingerling, which Liz likes to joke, fingerling is potatoes. It's a type of potatoes. I didn't even know that, but fingering is the weight. So how to understand when people are throwing out verbiage like this weight is needed for this pattern. They're not talking about like how much something actually weighs this way, because this ball and this ball have the same weight in terms of if you put it on a scale. They're both 100 grams. But how I like to think about it is how much yardage or meterage, depending on where you are and which one makes more sense to your brain, how much length fits into the similar weight. So when yarn companies and patterns and all of those use this thing and they talk about the weight of the yarn, they're not saying like this is super bulky, so it's really heavy, and this is fingering, so it's really light. They're talking about how thin or thick the yarn is, because how much can you get out of the same weight. So when I see the word weight on a pattern or on a yarn, I think about thickness. I just kind of, in the yarn knitting crocheting world, the synonym for weight is thickness. And so this one is really thin, so it's a lighter weight. Even though these are the same on the scale, you know? So, and actually this one might actually be 200 grams. I'm not sure, but yeah, I don't have an unopened package of this stuff to share with you, but like, if I take something, these looks like similar thicknesses, but not quite, right? So these are definitely both 100 grams. This is a fingering, which if they have the numbering system, it's a number 1. It is not the thinnest one out there. This is fingering, and it has about 400 meters or 437 yards. How I do head math, if I don't have a calculator, if you want to get from meters to yards, add 10%. So 400 meters is about 440 yards. This guy, for the same grammage, for 100 grams, This one only has 125 meters or 137 yards. There's a lot less yarn here for the same weight that there is here. And this stuff's a lot thinner than this. So that's one way to think about it. And then there are these general categories of thickness, and that doesn't mean all fingering weight is identical. There's these guys, this is only a partial ball, but a lot of fingering sock yarn, which has like merino or wool and nylon in relatively similar percentages, will have about the same yardage for 100 grams. Now, this is considered a worsted weight. I'm going to go through the yarn categories in just a second. This is considered like medium, a number 4 thickness. And this doesn't even have 150 yards on it. And this is because it's cotton and wool. And something that is 100% wool will have 220 yards on it, but be considered the same weight, the same thickness. But you don't have as many yards. So there's a thing that a lot of people use called wraps per inch, like the thickness of the yarn. How many times can you wrap it around a ruler in the span of an inch? That determines its quote unquote weight, like the category it falls into, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that kind of thing. But as you can tell, just going on that doesn't tell you how many balls of yarn to get, because the make-along project, which we'll switch to in a second, that I'm making, for my size is going to need 1,400 yards of yarn, at least. And if I just went off, if it said, hey, of the yarn I used, I only needed 500 grams. If I went off of grams, I would buy enough grammage out of this yarn and I wouldn't have enough yarn for the pattern. I like to go by yards. And it involves some math when pattern writers only use grams. When they say, okay, like Petite Knit is a great example of this. I love her patterns. They're fantastic. But she'll say, okay, you need 400 grams of yarn to do this project. But to figure out how many yards, especially if you're changing the fiber content, or how many meters, you're really going to have to take the yarn she used, which might be in 50-gram balls, and say, okay, I need 400 grams, which is 8 balls of her yarn, and then multiply it by the yardage in her balls, and then you get a total yardage, and then divide by the yarn that you are going to use. So when someone comes in and says, I need 400 grams of worsted weight yarn, I'm going to say, can we see your pattern? Can we make sure that you really only need 4 balls of yarn? Or might you need fewer balls, or might you need more? Because I say what I sync to, my go-to is go by the yardage or meterage, not by the grams. Because again, it's a little on the heavy side of worsted. It's a thicker yarn, but there's so much less. There's 50 yards less per ball. So if I bought as many balls as I thought I needed of wool of this, I would run out of yarn. If 1,400, if I was making it out of Cascade 220, that has 220 yards per. I'd only need 7 of them for 1,400 yards. For this, I may need 11. So it really makes sense to do the math. There's a calculator on everybody's phone, and that's what we do. I use the calculator function on my phone more than I use anything else on my phone, maybe social media or games. But for business at the shop, I am using the calculator on my phone 90% of the time. Sometimes I even accidentally go to the calculator when I mean to be making a phone call, because that's what I use so much. So in terms of weights, like what are the classification of weights? I'll take a couple of minutes on that. There are a lot of things that are even smaller than fingering. So this is lace weight for the wild swan that I'm making. And 100 grams of this has about 800 meters or 880 yards. And then fingering, which is the next one up. So sometimes they include this in a number 1, but it's even smaller. Fingering, and again, not everyone uses the numbers. And so sometimes you just have to go by like what needles it recommends, the yardage on it. But again, the yardage can change depending on the fiber content. So it gets a little crazy. This has 400 meters for 100 grams. So it's got half the yardage that this does. So lace, fingering. The next one, which I can't get to the ball because it's buried. This is sport, and this is cotton, so you really can't use this as a guide of yardage, but sport is a little bit thicker than fingering, and so it might have 300 something yards on it. Hang on a second, I'll be right back. Okay, had to take that. So sport weight is a little bit thicker, and I'm on a really big needle for this, so it's really stretched out. Like, not stretched out, but it's kind of harder to see what's going on with sport weight. DK is a really funky, that's the next one up. We have all these silly names for things, and half of them I couldn't tell you off the top of my head where they come from. DK stands for double knitting. And essentially, it's the same thickness as fingering held together, 2 strands of it, so doubled up. So I'm pretty sure double knitting came from holding 2 strands of fingering weight together. It's doubling the number of plies. This is often called a 4-ply. The ply thing is weird. When I have people come in and talk about plies in yarn, and then they look at me like I'm crazy if I don't know what they're talking about. It's because we've got the plies for, like sometimes there's only 2 plies in a yarn that's considered fingering, and sometimes there's 4. And 4-ply is what in Britain is fingering weight, roughly. Maybe a little bit fluffier than that, but it's considered fingering weight, whether or not it has 4 plies or not. And then someone came in asking for a 6-ply or an 8-ply, and their idea, what they said was 4-ply, I think might have been a number 4, which is worsted weight, which is the next thickness. So it's like everything gets super complicated, and every country might decide to try to come up with its own way of identifying things, and then there's a lot of confusion. In generations past, the plies would have been how they referred to yarns, and now the new system uses this weight classification, which may or may not be the same. And so it leads to a lot of confusion. It leads to a lot of older knitters coming into the shop, or more people who've been knitting for longer, thinking we don't know what we're talking about when the language has shifted. So this stuff is more of a worsted weight, which is just up from DK. So to review, we've got lace, fingering, sport, DK, worsted. And in the UK, I don't think they call anything sport. There's just variations on how thick or thin fingering is, or 4-ply. So worsted is right in the middle often. Like a lot of the Red Heart, the other things, a lot of stuff you can find. Wool Ease at the big box stores is a number 4. And that's where you use a size 8 needle or a 5mm needle. It's right in the middle there. The next thing up, I don't even know if I have anything here. I mean, technically, the next thing up, I've got, but this chainette doesn't really imply the lofty, the fluffiness of it. You've got chunky or bulky, depending, and that's number 5, depending on who's doing that. I should go back to say number 4 often has 200 meters or 220 yards. Chunky will have more like maybe 150, something like that. But this is not chunky, but this has less than 150. It all depends on the fiber. It gets crazy. Super bulky is the next one up from that. So bulky and then super bulky, because people started using chunky for super big stuff. So chunky is a number 5, super bulky is a number 6. And, I've got some super bulkies at the shop, like Encore Mega is our cost-effective super bulky. It's got 65 yards for 100 grams. So And that would be probably just under 50 something meters, you know, that kind of thing. And then there's jumbo. There's stuff that's even thicker than super bulky. So that starts to approximate the conversation about weights. And then on top of that, you've got thinner ends and thicker ends of those weights. So not all worsted weights are the same, and not all chunky weights are the same, which is why it becomes super important to test your gauge. When someone comes in and says, I'm an on-gauge knitter, that might have worked when there were only a few yarn companies and only a few pattern writers being hired by those yarn companies to write patterns. But so much can shift that. Like, yarn companies aren't using standardized ways of testing your gauge, or standardized. People will come in and say, I need this gauge. Find me a yarn that says it on it. And that's not always going to work, because we have all these different fibers of yarns being created with all these different, what the yarn company would like you to knit it on, which is not necessarily what's going to work for your project. And it just, yeah. So takeaways from this is try to go by yards or meters for how much yarn you need for a project, and test your gauge. And what I always say about gauge testing is if your stitches are too big or too small for the gauge, change the size of your tool. Don't try to change how you knit, because you have a rhythm to your knitting or crocheting. And as much as you might want to just knit tighter or looser, that won't stay consistent. What will stay consistent is the size of your tool. So go up a needle size, go down a hook size, that kind of thing. Okay. Like I said, I will try to link some videos I've already made on some of that stuff. And I'd like to switch over to first the make along. Actually, no. Change my mind. We're going to do finisher froggit. I just frogged my Dandelion shawl. Let's talk about that. And because this yarn was discontinued, and I gave half a ball away to someone who needed that very specific color to finish their project. So I might remake that later. I really encourage you all to, I think I talked about the 4 things I choose to do. I really encourage you all to take a look at your projects and really assess, do I really love this? And if you do, that's great. That becomes a moving on. Like, if you're not able to cut, like, my goal is to cut my number of unfinished projects in half. And if you really love everything you have on needles, you don't have to do that with me. But if there are things hanging over your head making you feel any level of shame because you haven't finished them, this is to free you of that. And it could be just to find a different way to free yourself of the shame of unfinished projects. If they don't bring you shame, for Liz, they do not bring her any level of shame at all, leave them. That's fine. That's totally fine. It all depends on how they're making you feel. If it's hurting your soul that you have this project and you think you may never finish it, it's okay to be clear of it. You know, that's what I'm going to do, is try to let go of that. I have a lot of projects in this very room that I look at and go, but I really want to, but am I honestly going to finish it? Probably not. Could those needles be better served somewhere else? Could the yarn be better served somewhere else? You know, it's like, it's okay. And again, that is also something that is going to be a personal decision for you, because it may not be okay. And that's okay too. It's okay to not be okay. Anyway, so the make along, I'm going to come back to that because I've made a lot of progress on my pullover. It's the Staffen by Rebecca Clow, a Crayabea. And I not only have made progress on my pullover that I want to show you, I had a class where we have someone who's making the cardigan, and we had a session on the Coach and Connect where we've got a bunch of people making the vest. And I decided, we have this yarn Merino 401 in the shop from Barocco that I haven't really played with yet. And I'm like, you know what? Because it comes in 50 gram balls. It's only about 100 meters or yards per ball. I was like, maybe that would be good. I wouldn't need a bajillion of them to do a vest. So I have started, I did my gauge swatch and I'm not quite getting gauge. I'm on a 9. Pattern calls for an 8. And I did some math and I am getting, okay, I am getting 17 stitches over 4 inches. And I tested it just in stockinette, but we found when talking with people on Coach and Connect, because the texture changes so much, that might work for the final project too, to just do your gauge swatch in stockinette. But we had a lot of discussions about how to do it in pattern and how you might want to do it in pattern. I was getting 17 instead of 16 stitches for 4 inches. Now what that means is, I put what I've done so far up here. Ta-da! What that means is that my stitches are too small. So I was getting 16 stitches on an 8, and I'm getting not 16, wrong way. I was getting 18 stitches on an 8. I was getting 17 stitches on a 9. That could mean I'd get gauge on a 10, but I don't know if I want my stitches to get any bigger for this yarn specifically. So I did some what I call magic math, where I took the total number of stitches after like when this is joined in the round, this is going to be top down, and when it's joined in the round, then I have my chest circumference basically. So I found where it's got the body number of stitches in my pattern, and I divided that by my gauge, which is 4.25 stitches per inch instead of the 4 that the pattern calls for. And I found, this doesn't always work, but I found going up a size should make it come out the size I want it to be. So I'm going to test that. But I've done, this is one ball of the Merino 401, and this is the back. The back is straight, and I'm going to, when I get to the right length and my size, the Staffen, what I've noticed, has a lot of different instructions for different sizes. And to me, that means she has done her work on, instead of just saying, well, we're going to exponentially just say, do this more, do this more. She's got more shaping involved for different sizes. So it fits, so it fits better. So I still have, whereas this you might be like, but that's not going to be big enough. First of all, it's got some stretch to it. And second of all, down here, I have more shaping that's happening before the different sides join. And I'm going to be coming back up here and starting the front parts of it soon. So this shows you the really cool texture of the Staffen pattern. There's ribbing, there's faux bobbles, there's, she calls it diamond brocade, and then the faux bobbles again, and then the ribbing. And then it'll repeat again. So the vest, you don't have to make sleeves, you don't have to do short rows, and it doesn't have the raglan seams that everything else does. So this guy, the one I'm going to need maybe even 11 balls of. So this is a Pima cotton and merino, and it's heavy. I will say it's heavy. So that whole thing about weight, yeah, there's only so much yardage for 100 grams, and it's going to be a hefty sweater. But it's also going to breathe a little better, potentially, because of the cotton. It's going to feel different against my skin. This is the pullover. Let's see if I can get it. I'm moving it the wrong way because I'm filming a mirror image. I don't have the collar on it yet, but you can see those raglan seams. There's 4-stitch raglan seams going on front and back with it. It is super, super pretty. Like the texture, a solid yarn with really good stitch definition is going to just pop with this. I am past sleeve separation, but it's currently on the needles. So I'm going to put on a barber cord while I chat with you about this and try it on. So what I've discovered is the pullover has short rows, German short rows, which happen in the front. Because the thing with raglan seams, now if you had an all over increase sweater like the one I'm wearing, this is Mountain Mist by Tin Can Knits. And because it doesn't have really specific seams where the shoulder increase, the room for the sleeves happens, you can have short rows just in the back and just kind of pump up the back. It adds more material to the back to make it sit kind of like a t-shirt, kind of like this guy, higher in the back than in the front. And with raglan, there's a different thing that goes on where the short rows are going to start in the back. Short rows are just going back and forth to get the height. And the short rows come all the way to the front. So instead of just zigzagging in the back to just add more material back there, it's kind of like you cast on the whole way and you start to, if I back up a second, how not just older versions, but some versions that don't have you cast on the whole collar, how they build, especially with a raglan seam, how they build the front lower is they'll only have you cast on to like here. And they'll have you start building, adding stitches right up here, making it a little slanted, and then cast on across. So the raglan seam in the round version of that is start in the back, come over here, making your increases, stop, purl back, come around here, making your increases, but on the purl side, and stop and go back, and then come around here a little further forward and go back. So it's like doing the Staffen in the round, you are while you're doing your short rows, you are increasing on your raglan seams on the way over, and then doing what we call a set row. A lot of raglan seams do that. Have one increase row and one set row. Have a set row on the way back, and then increasing on this side on the way over, and a set row on the way back. And sorry, I'm doing two things at once. It's always fun. Doing that until you hit the point where you can just start going across. So I'll show you what it looks like on this when I put it on. But that means you're doing increases on one side on the knit row and one side on the purl row, and you really got to just pay attention to the directions. So there's a lot going on in this pattern, because then there's the texture too. Although in the pullover, you're only doing the ribbing during that whole part. You're not having to like figure out where you are in the pattern and other things like that. So I had no idea when I picked this there would be so many options and so many flavors, but in some ways that's kind of fun. It lets you pick what you want, and paying for the pattern, you have access to all of it. So the cardigan, what I've discovered between helping people with the cardigan and kind of starting to look over more of the pattern myself, since I'm not making it, the cardigan has options for a high collar, which will look like a pullover with a split down the front, or a V-neck. And the high collar will have short rows, just like this one does, the pullover, but you won't have to figure out where you're making your increases. They'll always be on the right side during your short rows. So that makes things easier, because there's make one right and make one left just on the knit side. You don't have to worry about the purl side too. Now the vest, there's make one right and make one left, knit side and purl side, just for shaping, because they're doing something different. So she put a lot of work in this to have a lot of different options. So I really respect what she did. I've got my needle out. So now I'm going to try to distribute my stitches so I can try this on. So the high neck version of the cardigan has short rows, but only on the knit side to try to make things better and easier. The V-neck version, you don't need that because you're building the V-neck as you go. So the back's going to be higher anyway. So there's no short rows. So that could be a reason to do the V-neck. But just so you know before you head in, and if you've already headed in, you're already discovering and tackling these challenges, and good for you, because any of this you can do. I'm a firm believer. I'm here to help you if I can. If you're not joining Coach and Connect, you're getting what you can from these sessions where I just kind of babble on about what I'm doing and what people are asking questions about. So, again, this is the Tin Can Knits by, this is the Mountain Mist by Tin Can Knits. I love this sweater. I can't remember if I did the short rows on this or not, but you know, it fits nice. So I am going to put on and show you how my Staffen pullover is coming, because I have separated the sleeves, and I want to say I am about, there's the front. Okay. I'm about 2 or 3 inches past sleeve separation. I've used 4 balls of the Amano Touré so far, but, and like I said, I only tested my gauge on stockinette, but I think this is fitting decently well. Like, I Shouldn't have tied this that tight, so that's a little funky. But yeah, I think this is fitting nicely. Like my row gauge, I couldn't get my row gauge to match. So if anything, the sleeve separation happened a little low, but I like that because I've got room. I'm not constricted. So I'm happy to leave this on the rest of our time. But I don't know if you can see how this, it's almost comes to a little point, not quite. But if I hold this up, let me find something else to hold up here. You can see how the short rows built more material up here than on the sides or on the back. And that's really so the raglan seams can stay consistent. Because if we just, like the way the raglan seams are on the back, to go across, you would have funky stuff would be going on in the back if we didn't have this balance. But I really do love, I'm going to tilt this down a little bit. I really do love the stitch definition, how this is all looking, how it's feeling. It's going to be nice and warm. So it's not just going to be like a summery sweater, but that's okay. That's not what I was going for, even though it's half Pima cotton. It's cozy. It feels really great. And like I said, I'm done with 4 balls. You can see how far I've come. And she had a whole, if you hit row gauge, you're going to end on this row before you start your bottom. I'm probably making this longer anyway, because my girls tend to make things feel shorter than they are. So I'm really enjoying this though, but you can see how the pattern repetition shows up in light and dark yarn. These are different yarns that I'm using, but I'm really loving how it's coming out. So, and is the row gauge the same, or am I getting gauge on different needles with different yarn the same? Kind of, I can do that and it kind of works out. But yeah, so that's the stuff I wanted to fill you all in on today, is some of what I've observed. The pattern for this has like 1 million pages for all of them, but it's so you can find your size and go through and be like, okay, like she's got charts. I followed her charts of these increases of where to start the pattern so that it matches at sleeve separation. The underarms that you're casting on here, suddenly it all glides together right. So most everything she's got in these patterns is for a reason, and it's working really well, and I'm really excited about it. If anything, this might come out a little big on me, but the other thing about that is I'd rather have that it be a little loose than too tight, because I don't want it clinging to my curves. I'll put it that way. Yes, I'm on a journey to be at a healthy weight for myself, but that doesn't mean that I am going to knit it for the size I want to be. I'm going to knit it for the size I am right now. And I'm just going to focus on eating healthy and possibly exercising if I can. That's the kicker. That's kind of hard. But I think that's going to be it for now, because I think I've talked for a pretty long time. So if you haven't subscribed already to the channel, you hear this on all the YouTube things, please consider subscribing, and you can click if you want to be alerted to new videos and stuff. Final aside, I was hoping, I don't know, I have to go visit a friend today, and it might take a little bit of time in my day, but I'm still hoping if I can do a really quick, what happens if a knit yarn over knit drops? What do you do? I still hope to maybe shoot that off, but I don't want to make promises I can't keep. So the person who I kind of tried to talk through last week, if I can, I'll film one of those videos, but it's like I keep saying, I'm going to get yarn online. There's so much going on, and I'm finally back into teaching in-person classes. It can be a struggle to find the time, but stay tuned. Put your questions below this one for what you might want to hear about next, and I'll see what I can do to address them next week, and I will show you where I am on this. Now, I have made amazing progress on this sweater. However, again, since we're in Finish or Froggit February, I'd like to finish some half-finished projects this month too. So a lot of it depends on what I'm able to get to. And that could bog me down a little bit. So we'll see. But this project has February and March. It's just, I'd like to see how much of it I can do in those 2 months. So anyway, it's been good to talk to y'all. And as I always like to say, may your crafting be filled with joy and confidence. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.